Thank you for the invitation and also thank you for the introduction. So, as mentioned earlier, I'm currently a principal investigator of a research project funded by the German Research Foundation, which is focusing on the emergence of martial arts texts in the late Middle Ages. In the course of my research, I came across a unique and rather curious piece of evidence. While the concept of martial arts lineage is today most often associated with Asian martial arts styles, the 15th century fencing master Paulus Karl included an elaborate lineage of masters in all of his surviving martial arts treatises. In this lineage, a certain master, Johannes Liechtenauer, is presented as the founder of a society of masters, and Paulus Karl lists 16 masters in this lineage, placing himself... Sorry, how can I get back? Okay, there he is. Placing himself at the end of this list as a direct disciple of the allegedly most important first-generation master student named Stettner. The aim of my talk is to contextualize this piece of evidence in relation to European martial arts culture of the late Middle Ages. To achieve this, I will structure my presentation as follows. I will start with an introduction, but I will skip many details about fighting books, as my friend Daniel has already covered this topic in his keynote. I will then talk about the content of German fight books and approach these unique sources from the perspective of cultural history and the history of knowledge. In another section, I will present two 15th century fencing masters and fight book authors, the already mentioned Paulus Karl and his potential rival Hans Talhofer, and compare their strategies of self-fashioning as martial arts experts in a highly competitive martial culture. And finally, I will summarize and draw a brief conclusion. This slide is intended to give you a visual impression of the different types of fight books. First of all, we're dealing with a very heterogeneous corpus of texts. The earliest sample can be dated to the beginning of the 14th century, and currently we know about roughly 109 manuscripts and manuscript fragments, and about 78 printed works that have survived from the 14th century to the beginning of the 17th century. The range of languages includes Latin, German, Italian, French, Spanish, English, Dutch, and Portuguese. Within this corpus of European fight books, treatises written in German or Latin with German fencing terminology represent the earliest samples of a highly detailed martial arts treatises in a European context. Their emergence and the surrounding cultural and social aspects are therefore the focus of my current research project. "108 manuscripts and 78 prints is not an extremely large number of surviving sources, but it is a significant number. Late medieval Europe saw a rise in literacy and pragmatic writing during the 14th century and especially from the beginning of the 15th century onwards. However, there are many subjects about which we know very little and where we lack such rich sources as the fight books. So when I approach the fight books from a historical perspective, I often think of the old tip of the iceberg metaphor. The fact that such a significant number of elaborate records of martial arts techniques have survived means that the martial arts of medieval Europe must have been a very important cultural factor. And by studying the fight books, we can only begin to understand the significance and social impact of this martial culture. I will now turn to Johannes Liechtenauer, the master who is acknowledged as a Grand Master in the lineage of Paulus Karl. So far, we have no biographical data about this master, and he is only known as the authority behind 3 related fighting systems. These are fighting with a two-handed sword without armor, fighting on foot in full armor, and fighting on horseback in full armor. The earliest source also records his teachings on unarmed combat, but this text is not found in any other source and it's not canonized. Master Liechtenauer's teachings are composed of mnemonic verses designed to structure each lesson. The use of these verses must have been similar to the use of forms or taolu by Asian masters. They serve to organize, transmit, and remember the embodied knowledge of his specific style. The verses list specific techniques and relate them to each other, but they do not give information on how to perform these techniques, or for which situation they are suitable. In this way, the verses also protect Liechtenauer's art, because only initiates could understand of his system could understand their true meaning. The first mention of Liechtenauer's martial art is recorded in a personal notebook from the end of the 14th century or the beginning of the 15th century. What is remarkable about this notebook is that the author may have been a student of Master Liechtenauer himself. He records Liechtenauer's teachings and adds his own comments, explaining the arcane verses and giving clear descriptions of techniques and contexts of application. The second oldest example, from the 1420s, is also a rather curious piece of evidence. As the text of Liechtenauer's verses has found its way into a collection of quite different texts bound together in a German monastery. Particularly interesting is the fact that the verses are not associated with the Grand Master himself, but are marked as the teachings of a certain master Beringois. This could mean that there were already other masters, legitimate students or not, who spread the Liechtenauer system through their own teachings. The existence of at least one generation of students who built on Liechtenauer's teachings is proven beyond doubt by a manuscript dated 1452. In which the deceased master is depicted as a fully established authority, sitting on a throne, equipped with a blunt practice sword and a staff. In this manuscript, we find several commentaries on the master's verses alongside each other, so that we can clearly see the formation of a martial arts style in which the commentaries of the first generation of disciples became established teachings and are recorded alongside the textual legacy of the master. Looking at a selection of texts associated with or strongly influenced by Liechtenauer's system, we can see that his style was dominant in the German-speaking world for almost 200 years, and that it was disseminated in both manuscript and print. So, who were those masters who taught Liechtenauer's style? I will introduce 2 of them at the end of this talk, but first we need to take a closer look at the daily interactions of these men. This is a document from 1437 that was used to settle a violent dispute between 2 fencing masters in Landshut. Some of these masters traveled around the empire, teaching those who could afford their services in larger towns. But if the city authorities had granted a master the right to teach fencing in public, then the so-called law of the sword allowed other fencing masters to challenge him to a formal duel. This happened in 1437 to Jörg Helfenstein, who was challenged by Hans Kreuzberg and had to fight him in a duel with sharp swords and no armor in front of the elder men as judges. The fight did not end in the death of either combatant, but Helfenstein broke the rules and wounded his opponent after the judges had already intervened. He was banned from the city for 6 months and lost the prize money for the fight, as well as his right to teach in Landshut. We can see then that these professional or semi-professional martial arts instructors were engaged in a highly competitive trade that could lead to a formal duel, as also attested by the works of the Italian master Fiore de' Liberi. The mention of prize money in the Landshut Charter also points to the commercial to the commercial aspects of medieval martial arts. Within the Holy Roman Empire, fencing masters were among the first professional groups to be granted an imperial privilege, which gave them far-reaching rights. Due to the itinerant nature of their craft, they did not form a local guild, but a fraternity of masters called the Brotherhood of St. Mark. In 1487, Emperor Frederick III granted them the sole right to promote fencing in the empire and to examine candidates who wished to teach fencing. Candidates had to complete a period of apprenticeship, pay a substantial fee to the Brotherhood, and demonstrate their skills in a public demonstration. So in the next section, I will turn to the actual content of the fight books in the Liechtenauer tradition. But first, I would like to briefly outline how I conceptualize martial arts knowledge from my point of view as a cultural historian. I approach martial arts as a cultural phenomenon and above all as social institutions. These institutions are organized around fighting as a social practice and a mode of kinetic interaction between human bodies. Martial arts styles are thus ways of curating embodied knowledge and embodied techniques related to fighting practices. When it comes to conceptualizing this embodied knowledge, I draw on a concept coined by the French sociologist Marcel Mauss, which he called techniques of the body. It is currently being reworked by my colleague Ben Spatz, who defines it as follows, I quote, "Technique differs from related concepts like performativity and habitus in that it emphasizes the epistemic dimension of practice. Embodied technique then refers to transmissible and repeatable knowledge of relatively reliable possibilities afforded by human embodiment." End quote. I know this is a rather abstract way of thinking about martial arts knowledge, but it is precisely this level of abstraction that allows far-reaching comparisons to be made along the axis of time and space. Focusing on technique as a form of transmissible knowledge allows us to look at structural similarities between different martial arts styles in global, transcultural, and above all, transtemporal perspectives. This abstract perspective also allows us to ask fundamental questions, such as, if martial arts are indeed a way of preserving and curating embodied knowledge and technique, what is the cultural significance of writing books about techniques that can only be fully understood in practice through embodiment? And how did medieval masters nevertheless attempt to codify their knowledge using the most elaborate, time-stable medieval media available to them, namely texts and images? In the case of Johannes Liechtenauer, we can see that the most important aspect was to establish a specific technical lexis that could serve as a kind of shorthand for notating movement. In this example, you can see the master's mnemonic verses in which he mentions the 5 master strikes and then begins to treat the wrath strike. Our anonymous student of the system then comments on these verses to explain that the wrath strike is actually just a strike coming directly from the right shoulder. He also informs us that Liechtenauer calls this the wrath strike because it comes naturally and is usually the first choice of a person who is very angry with you. Although we have fairly conclusive descriptions of the respective technical terms, it is not an easy task to interpret them as a modern historian and a martial artist. But my time is limited, as I see. So if you're interested in embodied research and reconstruction, I've published my initial thoughts in Daniel Jacquet's open access journal, Acta Periodica Duellatorum. However, although the definition of technical terms is key to the Liechtenauer tradition, we can also find other strategies for codifying embodied knowledge, for codifying knowledge of technique within the fight book corpus. I have already mentioned most of them, such as the technical lexis, the prose descriptions, and Liechtenauer's mnemonic verses, as well as the glosses commenting on the enigmatic verses. But we can also find illustrations of important movements in the execution of a single technique, as well as some serial illustrations showing successive phases of movement. Finally, there are also a few diagrams showing the angles of certain cuts or geometric patterns related to the position of limbs and weapons. Could you go back one slide, please? Thanks. Another aspect that seems relevant to me is the level of abstraction with which fight books treat fighting as a mode of kinetic interaction. There are those who mainly collect useful techniques grouped by weapon or fighting discipline. Sometimes these techniques are logically linked as technique, counter-technique, and counter-to-counter technique. But however, the underlying system remains rather implicit in these writings, and they can be characterized as something like a phrase book that collects only ideal-type solutions to ideal-type threats. However, the texts... Could you go one back? Chase. However, the texts in the tradition of Master Liechtenauer are structured differently, and I think this may partly explain their popularity for almost 200 years. Liechtenauer's system can be characterized by its high level of abstraction, as the techniques are not only grouped into specific interrelated categories, but are also linked by the use of abstract concepts to address the fundamentals of martial arts training. Liechtenauer calls these the 5 words. These are 2 pairs of opposites, before and after, and strength and weakness, linked by the word indes, which means simultaneously, and is closely related to the action of feeling your opponent's vector through your own blade. This observation does not fully apply to all of the teachings associated with the Grandmaster, as the longsword is treated most eloquently, while armored fighting on foot and on horseback is much less interwoven with abstract fighting theory. We can also see that some authors of fight books, especially Liechtenauer's first commentator, who must have been a scholar, are more interested in theory than others. I will now turn to 2 very brief case studies of 15th century masters who left us their treatises. I've chosen Hans Talhofer and Paulus Karl because both of their teachings are directly linked to the Liechtenauer lineage. But while Paul Karl chose to integrate the aforementioned martial arts lineage into all of his manuscripts, his colleague and perhaps direct rival, Hans Talhofer, chose to subsequently erase all ties to the Liechtenauer tradition. Hans Talhofer is first recorded in the 1430s as a man-at-arms for the imperial city of Nuremberg, and later held a minor office as a tax collector. He produced several superbly illustrated manuscripts for noblemen who must have been his clients. One of Hans Talhofer's specialties was the preparation of his clients for the potential judicial duels, but such duels were the exception in the 15th century. Nevertheless, noblemen valued the martial knowledge of how to fight such a duel, as the defense of their rights and honor in single combat was closely linked to their cultural identity. Unlike Talhofer, who seems to have trained several noble lords during his career, Paulus Karl had close ties to one particular lord, whom he served for many years. Appointed in 1450 by the Duke of Bavaria, who resided in Landshut, he served him as in various capacities, from toll collector to full member of the court. After his lord's death, he changed courts and served another high-ranking nobleman, the Archduke of Austria, as his personal fencing master. Fortunately, we even know where Paulus Karl lived in Landshut. He's recorded as having lived in a wealthy and respectable neighborhood close to the ducal palace, as you can see from this wooden model from the 16th century. The house is still intact, and I was able to have a look at it the last time I was in Landshut. As a ducal residence, Landshut must also have been a center of martial arts culture. Remember that the duel between the 2 fencing masters mentioned earlier took place in front of the town's hall. And among our 109 manuscripts and 78 printed books, those written by Paulus Karl are the only ones in which we can find a lineage of masters that legitimizes the author as a second-generation master directly linked to Grandmaster Liechtenauer. Why is this so? I will try to answer this question in my conclusion. As a historian, I was suspicious of the lineage claims made by Paulus Karl. Since Karl's teachings consist only of image catalogues and contain almost no text, sorry, this is an old slide I forgot to, no, you can go further. No, further. Just click until the picture is complete. I had to compare the images with the technical descriptions in the Liechtenauer tradition. And although I expected discrepancies, I found the exact opposite. It thus seems that one of Paulus Karl's main achievements was to translate the textual commentary tradition into didactic images. And although he reorganized the content of Liechtenauer's teachings, Karl's fight books show a large overlap with the teachings of the Grand Masters and the second generation of students. I would therefore conclude that the claim of a direct lineage is highly probable. Unlike Talhofer, Karl presents himself as the legitimate descendant of one of the most popular martial arts teachers of the late 14th or early 15th century, which he may have well been. Talhofer, however, broke away from this tradition and emancipated himself by composing his own didactic verses and presenting himself as a very self-confident martial arts teacher. As can be seen in this illustration from a manuscript dated 1459, Talhofer wears a necklace depicting a winged lion with a sword. This could indicate that he was directly involved in the founding of the aforementioned Brotherhood of St. Mark, which received its imperial privilege in 1487, and thus gained a monopoly on the promotion of fencing masters within the Holy Roman Empire. To briefly summarize, the fight books point to a period in European history that can be characterized by the rise of influential cities that fostered a dense urban culture, an increase in literacy and pragmatic writing, and the growing importance of crafts and guilds. At the same time, we can see a fully developed martial arts culture with a high level of competition in which professional or semi-professional and resident as well as traveling fencing masters competed for paying students and lucrative positions at court. We also have evidence of a very early process of institutionalization in the realm of the Holy Roman Empire, culminating in the imperial privilege of 1487. Within this larger historical context, the fight books point to a community of practitioners and masters organized around the 14th century teachings of Master Johannes Liechtenauer. Talhofer and Karl are both part of this martial arts culture, in which both association with the teachings of Johannes Liechtenauer and the use of books are seen as markers of competence. Karl's use of a martial arts lineage to document his claim as a direct descendant of a Grandmaster Liechtenauer thus represents a specific and viable strategy of self-fashioning in a highly competitive 15th century martial arts environment. Thank you very much.